Welcome back to the One Shot Show. What you're about to hear is the full-length bonus episode for December. Usually these bonus episodes are exclusive to our Patreon backers. However, we're releasing this one for free. Think of it as a late Christmas gift from us. You're also about to hear me introduce the episode and thank you for backing us on Patreon, because we recorded this several months ago before I recorded this intro just now. If you do enjoy this episode though, make sure you go and back us on Patreon so that you can access these bonus episodes every single month all across 2026. Enjoy! Hello and welcome to the latest bonus episode of The One Shot Show. First of all, thank you very much for backing us on Patreon. If you are listening to this, it's because you back us on Patreon. Your support is very much appreciated. Tell all your friends to do it too. Things you can say about podcasts and not drugs. Today we're talking about a pet topic of mine. I call this the impossible problem. Now, many things are called impossible problems, Patty, but this particular impossible problem is very much to do with the nuts and bolts of tabletop RPGs from a business perspective, from the perspective of those who make and create RPG content, who run businesses relating to RPGs, and a tension that naturally emerges from the structure of play for an RPG. The impossible problem is very simple. At any given table, you have, say, 5 players, 5 people. 4 are playing, 1 is running. If you want to create a product, the most profitable thing you can make is interesting to the 4. But if you do not make products for the 1, the 4 do not get to play the game. There is a fundamental tension in all tabletop RPGs in that they cannot exist without GMs. They cannot exist without people willing to run games. It does not matter how many people want to play your game if nobody wants to run your game. From a business standpoint, this poses a problem because your company will struggle to be financially successful if it can only sell and appeal to GMs, because they are a much, much smaller slice of the market. I want to talk about this impossible problem, how all businesses in the tabletop RPG space can go about approaching it, can go about trying to solve it, some of the major pitfalls around it. This is a very different kind of topic to what we've often talked about, but I think it's a particularly pertinent one because of the life cycle of 5th edition, where a lot more people want to play 5th edition than are willing to run 5th edition. This has created a number of problems for Wizards of the Coast because they very quickly realized halfway through 5th edition's life cycle that they could sell a hell of a lot more books if every setting book also had player options.
Just that little crumble of player options in there.
Yeah, and it means they sell a hell of a lot more books. They're way more financially successful, but you know what those books are? They're not as good for GMs anymore. So they have run headlong into the impossible problem. And I call it an impossible problem because it fundamentally cannot be solved. There is no silver bullet. You will never be able to create the perfect system, the perfect publishing company, the perfect array of content, whatever it happens to be. You will always run into this problem. The question is, what do you do about it?
I mean, yeah, you've started with the big dog, haven't you? You've started with Wizards. And that was my, as you were framing up the topic, I was kind of like, that feels like their big thing that they attempt to do inside their product. It also got me thinking about how, like live play, like actual play streamers are kind of speaking to that as well, in a way that maybe is the closest to the solve that I can think of. A really well put together stream, a player is learning to play, a GM is learning to GM by watching it, and then maybe you're also getting entertained as part of the bargain. Not guaranteed.
Yeah, I would even say actually the stream version of this, of the impossible problem, is are you trying to appeal to GMs? Are you trying to appeal to players? Or are you trying to appeal to an even broader audience than that? Because let me tell you, you are going to make a hell of a lot more money in the actual play content creation space if you create something that has true mass appeal.
Which is maybe the silver bullet the Critical Role struck.
Oh, absolutely. They are the absolute benchmark of what that success can look like. However, you have to then make that mass appeal product without alienating that core product, that core audience who are D&D players who are interested in maybe something that's a bit gruntier. And one of the criticisms you might often see about Critical Role is how the players, despite making incredible amounts of money and despite doing this a lot, often don't seem to know the rules super well. And that can be frustrating when you're a player watching who's very familiar with the rules and you sort of like, I could do this better than them. And then it becomes alienating and it becomes unpleasant to watch. Now, I don't mean any of that as an actual criticism to Critical Role, but it is an example of where they too have bounced into that impossible problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Where do we sit in this? Where are we sitting in this dichotomy?
I actually want to. This is a fun one. I'm going to peel the lid off on this one because way back when sort of first devising this show, I was trying to figure out what exactly the core audience was, because at its heart, this is a GM advice podcast, and yet we do talk about a whole lot of things that are useful to players. And I sort of went, well, there's an obvious secondary audience, which is players who are maybe interested in GMing. There's then actually, I think, a tertiary audience of just players who want to know more, who are interested in the hobby. And I recorded a test episode, and a third party who listened to that test episode said, I think there's actually another audience that you haven't thought of, and that's people who are just interested in storytelling. Because that's something that we also talk about a whole hell of a lot on the show, is storytelling devices and narrative tools that we tend to apply to our tabletop RPGs, but you could just as easily apply to fiction writing, or you might just be interested in learning more about how the nuts and bolts of creating fiction and telling stories works because you read a hell of a lot. So that's how I've tried to solve the impossible problem from a content creator standpoint. But look, I just naturally am going to appeal to one or more of those audiences more than the others, and that's fine. I'll wind it back to, let's take the example of a game maker and publisher, and some ways you might want to approach the impossible problem from a product standpoint. So we talked about how 5th editions work around to needing GMs and needing to therefore create content for GMs so that there are people actually running their system, while also needing to be honest, make enough money to employ the people that they do. I'm not going to add any further snarky comments about that at this point in time. Their approach was, well, let's take those books that are traditionally for GMs and let's put some player stuff in them. And I think that's a very clever solution. I truly do. I think it's had unintended consequences. An alternative could have been, and this was what they were doing earlier in 5th edition, was just don't put out as much stuff. Just don't flood GMs with all these books and all these things, because if you've got like 8 different settings, you're only playing one game at a time. They can only run so many adventures. So that was their approach. Let's show another different approach. A different approach could have been little but often.
Yeah, I was thinking about that with MCDM. They did some great stuff here.
And this is a lot easier now in the world of digital content releases. And this is what a lot of the more indie publishers will do, because this is so much easier to do. I think it's actually one of the difficulties Wizards of the Coast have is because they're so established. Like, if they put out a product that is digital download only, and it's not something you could buy that beautiful book of, it feels a bit cheap. And it feels not befitting their sort of stature and status within the industry. And also, you can run into questions about ownership rights. Like, D&D players are quite old school, are quite physical and tactile, and we like owning stuff. But the little and often approach totally works for smaller publishers. You can just do small print runs of little things. You can do Kickstarters for short adventures. The word module comes from the fact that these adventures back in the day when, Wizards of the Coast, or actually, prior to their ownership, TSR, were, a small indie publisher, that's what they would do. They would release these neat little modular things, and you could play it, and it might only be a few sessions long, and you just sort of drop them into your worlds and maybe string them together with a wider story if you wanted. And if a new one came out and it was a suitable level for what you were running, you might just be able to drop that whole cloth and be the very next one. And each one was therefore much cheaper, and they were very exciting for GMs. They still ran into the impossible problem in that only GMs could buy them, but because they were frequent and they were small, it never felt like you were buying something you weren't going to use, even if you never ended up using them. And it also meant, from TSR's standpoint, the income wasn't too spiky, because little and often actually creates a very smooth income curve when you look over, a whole quarter's worth of sales. That being said, as we well know, TSR went under. They did still run into the impossible problem such that they couldn't solve it. They weren't able to keep the company alive. Now, I think this is a particularly interesting thing to talk about right now, because it is something I think Wizards of the Coast are facing in a very, very big way. D&D 5th edition is experiencing an exodus of GMs more than an exodus of players. You can see the knock-on effects of that. This, presents business opportunities. The number of paid GMs has increased. There are platforms that can help you facilitate finding paid games. There's still plenty of free games. It's not too hard to find one, but it is also nice to just be able to pay and have that guaranteed game. But what happens when there aren't enough GMs at all, including the paid ones? The price starts going up. That prices the players out. Well, now they're not going to bother. They're going to play something else where it's easier to get into a game, or, to be perfectly honest, they're just going to abandon the hobby whole cloth. They just won't bother.
Yeah. I think about it in terms of like the way that I consider getting, like, let's say that I've never gone and published a module. The thinking being, firstly, like I would never see any sort of like return on it. It feels also like the pool is now so big, but also I feel like there's all of my buy-in for D&D shows, D&D groups or publishers, is because what they've given me for free, and then the love that I have developed, the loyalty that I have developed as a customer through that. Like, I think about MCDM. He begins with his vast charisma and experience, tutoring game mastery. Time goes by, starts to publish. There was a fantastic run of Arcadia. Did you ever read any Arcadia?
I did read a couple. I submitted to a couple, actually, unsuccessfully.
There you go. So then Arcadia was something that I was really happy to put my money behind, and now it's at the point where there is Draw Steel out there, which is so fascinating because I feel a bit priced out of Draw Steel at this point.
A little bit, right?
Yeah.
A bit. And you're actually touching on a really interesting thing, in that in the history of RPGs, often it's been third-party creators that have helped alleviate some of the more pronounced parts of the impossible problem. If there is too much player-oriented content, let me take a great example. Have you ever bought a setting book, let's call it, Rime of the Frost Maiden, and found it lacking? Found that it just doesn't have stuff you need. And then you've gone on to this wonderful site called DM's Guild, and you have found a DM Rime of the Frost Maiden supplement, and it costs you $3. And you're like, hell yeah, I'll pay $3 so that I can actually run this thing that I've already spent, $60 on.
Yeah.
I'm trying to do quick conversions to US dollars in my head. Believe me, if you live where we are, those books are far more expensive. We really pay the South Pacific tax. And look, you're willing to do that, and that is how the impossible problem is being solved in that instance. But it is not being solved by Wizards of the Coast, because it cannot. It is an impossible problem by its very definition. Now, what has also often happened in the history of RPGs is often those stronger third-party publishers grow and they gain more traction, and they start releasing their own original things as well, because, as you say, they've built up that goodwill. They've built up that following. People go, well, these guys do so much great work to make modules that I am able to run, or make modules I've already bought runnable for me. I absolutely will buy a module that's been designed entirely by them. And then maybe those companies are called something like Paizo, and they split off to become their whole own Pathfinder. People used to call it 3.75 affectionately, because that's what it was. It took the open game license for 3.5 and it went, well, we'd rather just have a bit more of that. And it wasn't born out of the impossible problem in that case. It was born out of the fact that, oh, no, that's not true. I'm going to go ahead and say that it was, because the impossible problem that 4th edition was facing was that not enough people wanted to play it for what it was.
Yeah.
It was a very cool system. But fundamentally, it just couldn't attract enough people. It didn't matter if there were people who wanted to run it. It didn't matter if there were people who wanted to play it. Those people were not in great enough numbers that they could find each other. The product failed because it ran into the impossible problem of truly appealing to everyone. Now, it was in comparison to a previous product of theirs, rather than as a GM versus player product. And what was born out of that was the edition wars, as they're now called, but Pathfinder existed. People called it 3.75 sometimes. Then Paizo went ahead and made Pathfinder 2nd edition, which still was built off the same open game license. Even though it was expressed very differently, it took, one direction of idea of design and took it further. It took it elsewhere. It didn't feel like 3.5, but it definitely didn't feel like 5th edition either. And now, funnily enough, what's happened is, after the OGL scandal, they've developed their own game license. They are now, what was originally a sort of group of hobbyist creators have now created their own publishing behemoth with their own system and their own products that in turn have third-party content creators supplementing their products.
And you go a bit further, like when you consider what, like everything you're laying out there historically, it makes me realize that prior to basically the rise of the streamed game, how little access there was for a player to access something that they could understand what D&D was, to approach it. It would have been so much more on the GM to solve that problem, which maybe then makes sense why the business model was focused so strongly on targeting resources for the exclusively for the GM, and maybe where they're tinkering with it now. You needed the GM in order to read the book, in order to run the game, and there was no other way for a player to access a live game.
The other thing you actually needed a lot of back in those days as well, if you want to talk about customer difficulty, look, okay, let's say you're Wizards of the Coast and you create Dungeons and Dragons products. The end consumer is either the player or the GM. The actual buyer is a wholesaler or a distributor, and their customer is a retailer, and their customer is the player or GM. There's a lot of layers of abstraction there. Yeah, you need that end demand from the player, but in terms of who's actually buying your product, it's the friendly local game store. So the two major avenues for actually getting your products to the public, and then if you were a member of the product, to actually accessing those products and learning about D&D and how to play it, GMs were a huge part of recruiting players, as were game stores.
Yeah.
Game stores had to champion a particular system.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
So the game also had to appeal to the people who owned game stores, because they want to fill the seats at their stores. They want a game that people are interested in playing. That means they don't want it to be little and often. They don't want to have to buy, 20 new books a month that are all small but take up tons of shelf space between them and are quite slow moving on an average. That's a bad business model for them. Board games have this problem, by the way. If you've ever gone into a board game store with tons of board games, they're very hard to keep running because the amount of stock you have to carry in order for any one person to come in and find the game they want is huge. But if someone comes into your store and they don't find the game they want, they may never come into your store again. So you constantly have to stock all of these games that the average person isn't buying, so that the one person who will buy that game can buy it when they come in. It's really difficult to manage those stock levels. Local game stores deal with the exact same problem. And actually, the pattern of content releases that we now have for all these big established systems and the way those books are published and the timing of it. A lot of it is actually dictated by some of the retail challenges with getting these systems out to market. Now, again, the shape of this has changed. That is, I won't go into it now, but that's a big part of what eventually happened with TSR. It was frankly too much. But nowadays, you have the internet, you have these different distribution mediums, but they're not always appropriate for some companies. I still expect to be able to buy a Dungeons & Dragons book physically, and if I could not buy that book physically, if I could only buy it digitally, I would feel like quality is being compromised, and I would also feel like I don't own the thing that I'm buying. However, when it's a small independent creator and it's a digital download PDF, I don't feel hard done by there. So not every company, not every creator can access every medium of getting their product out to the end consumer.
I'm curious. You don't have to answer this question. We could cut it out. What do you spend your money on in Dungeons and Dragons? Like, where is your dollar going? This is where my thinking has been going as you've been going through this. I'm actually wondering, like, where my investment goes.
Books.
Yeah.
Books, because at the end of the day, I also want to play, and I'll actually take the example of a player-facing book. Let's take a book like a Xanathar's Guide to Everything type deal, something that is a predominantly player-facing expansion to the rules. Now, there's useful GM things in there, don't get me wrong. I am inclined to buy that copy of the book because once I own it, nobody else needs to own it. It's at the table. Now other players might want to buy it. And this is... I don't know that I need to get too into this, but I think it is another thing that actually Wizards of the Coast have got wrong and misunderstood with their sales, and how they've designed their products as they've gone, well, if we can sell it to players instead, then we can sell 4 times as many of
but that's exactly what I was thinking. I, as the GM, buy the things for my players often.
Exactly.
And their recompense is in, I don't know, the generosity of time at the table. But I agree with you. Like, I have a D&D Beyond account that we use to build characters. I have all of these books.
I bought 2 copies of Xanathar's because I was sick of my players squabbling over the one.
Yeah.
I wanted there to be multiple. So I bought that one. And one of my players also bought a copy, but not all 4. So we had 3 copies between us. So on a table average, we had bought 3 books. We had. That's about as good as a result as you can get out of 5 people interested in the game, is for 3 book purchases from that table. But I think from a business standpoint, at least in the instance of Wizards of the... And look, this isn't intended to just be a dunk fest on Wizards of the Coast. That's not what I wanted this to be. But there's been a fundamental misunderstanding of how that book purchase takes place. Now, I think there has been a really interesting noise that's been added to that sales stream that has caused Wizards of the Coast to steer wrong. And it's something that I think we all instinctively know and don't really love talking about a whole lot because it feels really rude to say. 5th edition has become so fucking popular that people who don't play 5th edition, that will never play 5th edition, are interested in 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons. They might spend a lot of time thinking about it, talking about it, watching actual plays, going on forums.
I have friends who've spent money on books of campaigns that they never run.
They've bought the books, and I think that's where the noise has been introduced. I think it got so popular that there was actually a significant contingent of people that aren't even actually players who spent that money, and it got misinterpreted as the players buying the product. I truly think that's what's happened. It's a weird way to say suffering from their own success. But I'll go back to that previous thing that we were talking about with Critical Role, where they have multiple different audiences, one of which doesn't play RPGs and never will. And that's okay. There's nothing wrong with that. But if the product started to become too focused toward that person, they would very quickly lose that D&D audience. They would turn their backs on them. And I think that's what's happened, unfortunately, with Wizards of the Coast. It's not that there's all these players who are buying the books and the GMs are becoming less and less interested. Yes, the GMs are becoming less and less interested, but I actually think a lot of the people that have bought those books in such fantastic volumes aren't actually playing games of Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition. Wizards of the Coast have charged unwittingly headlong into a brand new version of the impossible problem because this has never happened before. There has never been a system that has been such a cultural phenomenon that there might even be a market of buyers who aren't even using your product.
Wow. Wow. Fascinating.
That has been a really interesting episode of the One Shot Show. Not where I actually expected to take this, but thank you very much, dear listener, for tuning in, and we will see you in the next one.
We hope you enjoyed that bonus episode of the One Shot Show. We release these every single month. They're a little bit longer than our usual episodes and allow us to go a little bit deeper into topics that don't quite fit the weekly 15-minute format. If you enjoyed it, please do support us on Patreon so that you get access to every single month's bonus episode. It's been a really great first year for the One Shot Show since our launch. We're so grateful to everybody who has subscribed or followed on whatever your platform of choice is. We have so many fantastic topics already planned for 2026. We cannot wait for you to hear them, so have a happy new year, and we'll see you in the next one.